Om Shri Chinmaya Sadgurave Namaha. So as we pay our humble homage to Pujya Swami Chinmayananda ji, we are taking up the first topic among the panel discussion, which is philosophy. And as we all know, philosophy is something which is a very systematic, rational study of very fundamental questions connected with existence, truth, realization, so many different aspects that we heard from our revered masters today. Now, let us see how Pujya Gurudev has unpacked many of these philosophical and religious foundations. We will also see, because this is about all philosophy, and it is, if we have to bring the philosophy to the masses, he actually brought in conceptual logic. Like, for example, we have already heard about BMI and Adhyaropa Apavada, and so many different concepts to us. So, what are his intellectual contributions? So, this is another thing we will look at. And we will also, if we have time, deliberate on Advaita Vedanta a little more from our side. And how does this really, the philosophy of oneness and universality, how does it come together? How did you see the philosophical aspect in a very broad sense? How Gurudev really approached the philosophy aspect of it and made this kind of very simple to the masses. So I'm going to just give it to Siddhartha first, and then we will go on. Yes.
So just to answer that question, I think Pujya Gurudev was he was a mirror for people. So one thing that he brought that I'll talk about a little bit more today is he brought a psychological aspect to the discussion for people in today's world that had never, I think, been done before in that way. And just to keep it brief, I think that was an overview.
Sabhaye Namaha, Sabhasabhyo Namaha. For the first round, I'll limit myself to the reflections. Philosophical reflections I will take up later. I very clearly remember my first engagement with Pujya Gurudev or Gurudev's mission was when I was in my 7th standard. My Sanskrit teacher motivated me to enroll myself for a Bhagavad Gita competition, and that was my first engagement into all these things, into Gurudev ji's teachings, into Bhagavad Gita, into the whole spiritual world. I think this itself tells us a lot, that the way he could conceive of ways and means of reaching out to young ones, children, I think that has something that has led a lasting impact. So this was my first engagement, and the journey began from there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hari Om. Talking about Gurudev's philosophy. Gurudev's philosophy. I cannot really talk about his philosophy because he made it come alive. It was no longer theory, it was no longer words, it was no longer all kinds of philosophies to share with us. And that is the beauty of his teaching, that he made it real for our lives. He made those words, he took words that could be totally dead and made them alive for us in our hearts, in our lives, every day.
Thank you, each one of you. Now, I'm going to start with Rudit ji. You are probably the senior most here, not only in age and everything, but you are one of the senior most disciples of Gurudev in the West. And you met Gurudev in 1966. You were the founding editor of Mananam, and Mananam is such a very powerful way of conveying the Vedantic truths as different topics. It's something that we just love. You've written so many different books, and some of the books, which one of them, I don't know if many of you are aware, the book Undoing is somewhere where I could see a lot of Gurudev's philosophy, which you related that to day-to-day events. At every breath of teaching, that's another book where you actually interviewed a lot of people. Now tell me, how did Swami Chinmayananda present Advaita Vedanta as a universal way of understanding? And he did this not as a belief system, but as a universal way, not limited to any particular religious and philosophical groups. So how did he do that?
I can give you several examples. I'll start with one from the very early days when I first heard him in the late 60s. It was also in those days that hippies took over San Francisco milieu. And somehow talks were arranged, 3-day talks by Gurudev in Haight-Ashbury district of the hippies in San Francisco. Well, this is quite something to teach Bhagavad Gita to the wild hippies, the flower children of the 60s. He taught for 3 days, and I remember on the 3rd day, as we were leaving the venue, somebody was saying, "Oh, that made a lot of sense. It kind of reminds me of the way my Catholic Church taught me in the early days." And I had to think about that. He wasn't teaching Catholicism. He was giving these people, this one man, gave something, the underlying message under all the various religions of the world. So this man who had grown up as a Catholic heard Vedanta and heard the echoes. That's the beauty of Gurudev's teaching. If you want to hear more, I can tell you an example that's a favorite of mine that has stuck with me, because Gurudev really knew how to touch anybody, any audience, to explain, for instance, what happens in our minds when we get so perturbed about a certain problem, and it consumes us so totally, and it ruins our lives practically. So he told this long story. There was a man who started suffering from a major earache. He was suffering so much and finally went to a doctor and said, "Doctor, do something, do something. The pain is not bearable." So the doctor examined him and took blood and blood pressure and the whole works and found nothing wrong. Then he conferred with some other doctors, his co-doctors at the hospital, and they came up with a scheme. They said, "Okay, we're going to do an operation on your ear." And they took big pincers and went into his ear and pulled it out with a lot of drama and showed a fly that had been buzzing in his ear. Of course, the fly was never there. They found a dead fly somewhere, stuck it in his ear, and then pulled it out. Well, this speaks to anybody who's ever faced a problem, faced a lot of agitation. What do you do? Here is an example of how even the biggest problem a human being can have is still a mirage.
Wow, that is such a wonderful story. Thank you for reminding us of that. And I remember another story which Gurudev would always say. This is about this man who thinks he's a mouse. And his wife takes him to a psychiatrist and goes through many sittings, and finally the psychiatrist convinces him that he's not a mouse. So he goes home. And as soon as he goes home, he just runs out immediately saying that, "Oh my God, there's a cat." So this was another way that Gurudev used to remind us that how we never get out of our own impressions on who we are, And so many stories like this, which through stories, he actually brought us this philosophical truths. Moving on, I think, Dr. Vinay ji, in what way did you think Gurudev's discourses, how did he interpret Bhagwan Adi Shankaracharya's Advaita Vedanta, and how did that help in addressing some of the ethical, social, and intellectual concerns of the 20th and the century that we are living in? Because obviously Bhagwan Adi Shankaracharya's philosophy probably would have been made for long time back. How did that translate? How did Gurudev translate that?
One of the notable features of our great masters has been that though they are inspired and they are presenting timeless wisdom, they have always brought it to the needs of the contemporary society. If we look into Shankaracharya, his main opponents or his debatees were from the Buddha tradition, from the Sankhya tradition, and he engaged them through and through in all his discourses. But when we came to Pujya Gurudev, it was a completely different time. In fact, it is a different time than what we are today. We should go back to the 1950s. It was a time just India had got its independence. We were politically independent, but we were having the colonial weight, burden hanging over us. Psychologically and spiritually, we were fragmented. There was economic scarcity around us, and there was a great sense of inferiority that had been built into our own beliefs about our traditions. Somehow there was a fascination for the westernization, scientific temperament, so on and so forth. And whatever little of religion was left, it was mostly limited to certain mechanical practices, rituals, mechanical chanting, and perhaps for some social conformity. So these were the concerns through which people were practicing, and it was precisely at this time, around 1950s, when Pujya Gurudev started his teachings. So he had many things to address. One of the things was the way, how do you communicate? Because it was the first time these teachings were brought about from ashrams to auditoriums. Earlier it was confined to ashrams. But someone could see that there is a need to bring it to the masses and bring it in the language of the masses, and also respond to the current sensibilities and concerns of the society. What kind of people was he addressing? Mostly urban, educated, middle class, aspirational, who had developed a fascination for scientific temperament. So this was the community he was addressing, and he had to check in all the boxes while delivering. So he couldn't just give Advaita Vedantic idioms just as they were being taught. It had to be brought into lived experiences. So if Advaita Vedantic vision is about experiencing oneness, it should also ensure there cannot be any sort of exploitation. Oneness has to come in that manner. Because exploitation is not just a moral lapse, but it's also a huge cognitive error which is not acceptable in Advaita Vedantic tradition. So that was one thing. And again, this whole engagement was not, or rather this understanding was not withdrawal from the society, but engagement with the society. That's where Karma Yoga comes in. So society is not something that hinders your spiritual growth, but it is an akhada, a space where you really hone your skills and work your way through it. So Karma Yoga becomes essential part of it, the way he presented it. So in this manner, he really addressed the concerns of those times and idiots, and in fact, I think the greatest gift and blessing that he brought was the language, the great oratory skills. And he was so precise, clear, and he made this knowledge accessible. I think that is the biggest contribution that we can note of Pujya Gurudev. And he was also very particular about hypocrisy that was there in the society at that point of time. In fact, in one place he says, the reason why you ring the bell so loud is because your mind is elsewhere. Not that the God needs to hear, but you are elsewhere, therefore you are ringing the bell for yourself in the temples like that. Or many such phrases. Or in one interview, he says, like the way he could use ordinary words and bring in the extraordinary dimension of that teaching. He says, if I have to compress Vedanta in 2 statements, he says, it's shut up and get out. So shut up all the thoughts that are there in your mind and get out of the limiting working of your ego self so that you discover your true nature. This is essential Vedanta, and this is the way Gurudev brought it out. Thank you.
Of course, his approach, many times the traditionalists really did not like it, right? They were saying that, you're making Vedanta too popular, you're making it too scientific and everything. But Gurudev always maintained that a philosophy that cannot solve the problems of the modern man is merely a museum piece, right? So it's the communication which Gurudev employed, whether it was different groups of people or whether it was different times, there was always that impact that we could see from that. So, Dr. Siddhartha, tell me about how did Gurudev's presentation of Vedanta compare with other modern Vedanta thinkers in terms of, accessibility, in terms of being faithful to the Shastras, and also philosophical clarity also. How would you compare Swami Chinmayananda to the giants of modern Vedantic Renaissance, such as Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, Ramana Maharshi? So can you throw us some light on that?
Thank you so much. Hari Om. Pranams to Puja Guruji Swami Tejomananda. I'm a little overwhelmed seeing Swami Tejomananda, and also about the holiness of this place and the holiness of the people here and the holiness of the day. And to just start this, I want to just say something that I think is appropriate, which is just from a verse, which is Mauna Vyakya Prakatita Parabrahma Tattvam Yuvanam Varishistante Vasad Rishiganer Avritam Brahmanishtahi Acharyendram Karakalita Chinmudram Anandamurtim Svatma Ramam Mudita Vadanam Dakshinamurti Mide. In this place, that verse, salutations to the Guru, who is a light. And the last 2 lines for Grahasthas, I was 9 years old when Swamiji came into my life, when Gurudev came into my life. I don't know where that flow of grace came from, but this is the end of that sentence right now. And I'm here with you because of Dr. Putney's grace. I covered for him in his class, for the chaplaincy class that Vilasini runs. But that last line is what we saw, which is reveling in himself with a smile on his lips. And anybody here who had the opportunity to sit in a 5 a.m. meditation with Gurudev would also understand the first line. Mauna Vyakya Prakatita Parabrahma Tattvam Yuvanam. The transmission, just heart-to-heart transmission that Gurudev was all about. So I think as a Manasaputra of Puja Swami Shivananda and Maharaj Tapavanji, from those heights, Gurudev was that Ganga, right? An inundation for the world, not just India. I was in Orlando, transformed my mother, transformed that place. She became a teacher in this tradition also. And experiencing that inundation now, I think it's nice to be whispering in the shadows of giants, because what I want to say has already been said today, which is that the uniqueness from 1836 to 1993, India produced maybe 20 certified illumined beings. And Gurudev was unique in that he was both a Dakshinamurti and that beloved charioteer on the battlefield. And a lotus and a Sthita Prajna, an example, a manifestation. Because he didn't just stay in one place, right? Like a Vivekananda, a rebirth, and as a 14-year-old boy, 13-year-old, 12-year-old boy, this has also been said, as a smart aleck, I was looking for all the holes, hard looking for holes. I couldn't find them. And being in his presence, the equanimity, that I never saw a hole in that. So I think that was unique, because he spoke to everybody on equal terms and could reflect who they were. So I think that was a very unique presentation.
Thank you, Siddhartha. Moving on to explain the philosophy of any subject, we need to see where did Swami Chinmayananda fare in terms of his intellectual writings, right? So, I mean, this is just a number that I came across on the internet that Gurudev, apart from the commentaries and everything what he's written, there are about 95 books that has been written by him. He was also a visiting professor of Indian philosophy at several American and Asian universities, and he's conducted university lecture tours, as we all know, in many of the countries, right? So, Ruditji, can you tell us about how Swami Chinmayananda used the concept of Jnana Yajna to make the study of the Vedanta accessible for people?
Well, some of what I said earlier, I can just repeat and embellish. Because even though one could talk about Vedanta as a system of thought, a philosophy, Gurudev was brilliant at making it alive for us, bringing it into our lives in a way that we could apply every moment of our lives, every day, if we just remembered certain things that he taught. And I just want to tell you, it may not have anything to do in particular with yajna, but it has to do with how he used certain concepts, certain expressions within the yajna venue to remind us how to live Vedanta fully every day. He so many times told us, be quiet, alert, vigilant. And we first thought, 3 words sounds very interesting, good. You know, it's easy to say, it's too simplistic. But when you think about it, it's the basis of what could bring us closer to realizing our true self. Be quiet, shut up, don't do all that mental talking that we constantly do. Be alert. In other words, stay in the present, and if you stay in the present, you will be vigilant and you will see what the needs are beyond just your own true self, your own self. You'll see the whole world around you, you'll see the needs of others, and the crux of this whole approach is that it brings you into the present. And it's the present is the only place where you can realize your true self.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Dr. Vinayachandra ji, can you give us some idea of how Puja Gurudev used the BMI chart to make complex Vedantic ideas easily accessible so that any lay person can understand the philosophy behind Advaita Vedanta?
This is yet another distinguishing feature of the greatest acharyas that this tradition has seen, that sometimes the essential teaching is very small or very little, but however small or short that message might be, it needs elaborate ways of communicating it. In fact, in one place in the Bhagavad Gita, Shankaracharya rakes up this question. He says, Naitesham shlokanam paunarukyam chodaniyam. You should not consider that this is being redundant because the same idea is being presented again and again. But why? Vishayasya duravagamatvat. Because of the nature of the topic that is being presented, it requires a detailed consideration and treating it again and again. And that is where the teacher comes in with his Chhatra Vatsalya, I can say, with the love that he has for his students, to come up with varied examples, illustrations, analogies, and communicate that meaning effectively. And Swami Chinmayananda used this approach in a very effective manner. I don't know if I can see any other teacher in the modern times who could come up with such ingenious examples, presentations, analogies to the extent of Puja Gurudev. In one place, before getting into the BMI, I just want to bring out this beautiful example which really made a mark upon me. He says, in the progression of a bud to a flower to the fruit, if we take this analogy, bud is beautiful in itself. An individual is beautiful in himself or herself. But when the full personality stands out, blooming as a flower, it is much more beautiful. That's how the ego self blossoms fully into the world of action. But after a while, you see the petals falling off one by one. For someone who is only familiar with that aspect, he feels bad. The flower is drying up. But the full fructification of this journey culminates with the arrival of the fruit. For someone who knows this journey arriving into the fruit, when the ego self has also dissolved, the falling of petals one by one, the real fruit emerges. That is how the real self emerges. I think this analogy itself is so beautiful. Each aspect of the journey is beautiful, but as you progress, much more beauty starts emerging, and the fullness and completion is where it culminates. So this is the kind of examples that he used to give. And one of the concepts, he made it so simple and accessible to everyone, was the Adhyasa concept of the Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta. Normally it becomes quite difficult for those who are familiar with the Adhyasa Bhashya, the introduction to the Brahma Sutra of Acharya Shankara. It's one of the magnum opus work, but still to engage with it, you require a certain minimum level of scholastic training to understand and appreciate it. But whereas in just one simple chart, BMI chart, again, other ingenuity is to pick up something which is already popular. BMI as a concept became popular around 1970s when papers were published around the body mass index. I don't know from when Swamiji took it up, probably around that time or a little later, but he took up that acronym which was popular and presented this idea of Adhyasa, where B refers to the body, the sensory motor apparatus, mind is Yam, and I is the intellect, which are the instruments through which the higher consciousness acts. But generally, it gets mistaken for the self itself. So from BMI, you engage with the world. So for the body, the object, it's the object and the world outside. For the mind, it is the emotions, and for the intellect, it is the thought. So on the objective world, you have objects, emotions and thoughts. That is the objective world. The instruments are BMI, and in the engagement with this, there is the PFI that comes out, that is the Jiva. So one who perceives the world through the body, the taster, even the way he presents them with the emphasis, taster, smeller. I mean, it really makes an impact. Once you hear it, there's no way you are going to forget it. So one who smells, one who touches, one who tastes, that is the perceiver, the P. And one who feels all these things, feels the emotions through the mind, is the feeler. And one who thinks these thoughts is the thinker, that is the Jiva. So the higher consciousness, through the instruments which is engaging with the world, it has created a false self called PFI. So this is how it is. And this whole framework that he gave, it was a very good pedagogical framework. It's easy to explain and understand each one of these concepts. It was also a good diagnostic framework in the sense to help you understand where the problem is. My mind is acting in an impulsive manner. So the problem is coming from M, or the body is pushing itself in a compulsive manner. So either impulsive or compulsive, that's where the problem lies. And therefore intellect is not being able to act accordingly. So in this way, it also helps us as a good diagnostic tool, and it also explains many other things. What is stress? Stress is where your mind is impulsive, body is compulsive, and intellect is unable to act. That is when you know it, but you can't act. That is where the gap which leads to stress. What is excellence? When there is an alignment of all the three, that is excellence. So in this manner, it offers us both, it presents itself as a pedagogical tool as well as a diagnostic tool, and also the way he could connect it to the Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga and Jnana Yoga as a way out of it. Working through the body, selfless action leading to Karma Yoga, purifying the emotions, that's where Bhakti Yoga comes in for the mind, and inquiry, which brings in about the Chitta Shuddhi, that is the way of Jnana Yoga. So in one simple few letters, it was maximum about 9 letters, BMI, PFI and OET. Yeah, with these 9 letters, you could explain the entire Vedanta and make everyone remember it so well. So I think that's where the beauty lies.
You're right about that. So not only the duality aspects that I think we concede, but when you go beyond that whole concept of the 9-point diagram, you can also approach the non-duality aspect. So there is so much in just one diagram, even as Pujya Swami Advainanji was explaining about how in one BMI chart he was able to connect this whole aspect. Now, Dr. Siddhartha, you were at one time in a talk in New York where you were connecting Vedanta to a little bit of a Jewish philosophy, and you were trying to explain the same non-duality concept and the comparison and the similarities. So can you talk a little bit about that?
So I'm doing a 1-year fellowship in Kabbalah, which is a Hasidic or Neo-Hasidic tradition based on almost identical ideas to Vedanta. And I would just posit that the BMI chart also explains a lot of neuroscience, psychology, and maybe even physics, which we'll get into a little bit this afternoon. Yes, I think this non-duality aspect is there in Kabbalistic, in Judaism, Kabbalistic Judaism, which is a 13th century addition to Judaism, and probably came from Vedanta, and probably came from that path. But I do remember Gurudev's teaching on this in terms of, and it's already been said also, in terms of non-duality and the notion of sarvatma bhava, the notion of having a sense that everybody is your own self. But I just want to say there's a unique way that Gurudev did that, which, to get back to Dakshinamurti and mirrors, is, like I said, everybody saw what they needed to see in him in a unique way. Meaning he could talk with anybody from a 2-year-old to a cranky 50-year-old and be able to talk with them on their own terms. So I think that aspect of him being able to hold other people's conditions and be able to empathize with them on a very, very mundane level. Here's a beautiful Gurudev example of the Fisher-Price steering wheel. In Orlando, he gave this example in 1985, that the baby has the Fisher-Price steering wheel in the back of the car, and when the baby's turning the wheel right, somehow the car goes left. Meaning we think our ego is like that little one who's driving the little wheel when we're in the hands of a Mahashakti that's a bigger car, a bigger driver is going on. But that kind of an example in suburban Florida is very, very, very poignant and explains Vedanta on a very, very great level, knowing where we were coming from. So I think his ability to know where we were coming from was a manifestation of this non-duality, that he could embody our own experiences in a way that was very unique.
So just a continuation on that part of this non-duality aspect, and since you're a doctor as well, how do you see where Gurudev was able to reconcile this non-duality with moral responsibility and social obligations?
I remember, I think I've heard this many times since, but the first time I heard this was, again, around the age of 11 or 12, when Gurudev actually made a point that compassion is not the best case scenario because that involves another, and already you're in trouble. So he described this as somebody had said, Swami Advaitananda ji said about touching the hair, and Swamiji said, when you scratch an itch on the left arm with the right arm does not talk about dharma, or how the left arm needs help, or how badly it's hurting, it's just reflexive. So a sense of sarvatma bhava or non-duality, it takes the ego decision-making out, and it's just an automatic behavior. You're a nimitta, you're an instrument, right? So you're an instrument to reduce suffering automatically. So I think that's the idea that he tried to get across, that it shouldn't be a matter of compassion, because that can lead to ego. But it should be a matter of automaticity.
So with this, we come to the end of this panel discussion. On behalf of our team, we would like to thank the organizers for giving us an opportunity to reflect upon the philosophical aspects of Pujya Gurudev's teachings. Thank you and pranams.